The Monetary Policy Committee of the South African Reserve Bank, which has just decided to unanimously keep the repo rate unchanged at 6.75%. Joined in studio to dissect this a little bit more by Nikki Weimar, who is Senior Economist at Nedbank, and Gerald Mwandi-Ambira, who is currently Acting CEO at the South African Savings Institute. Folks, thank you so much for the time. Nikki, let's start off with you. Unsurprising decision, of course. Not much really changing even in this meeting.
No, I think the analysis is pretty much very similar to what we've heard before, with the exception, of course, of November last year, where we did have a far more sort of hawkish undertone to the monetary policy statement and the actual speech by the governor and the response to the question session. So yes, very predictable, basically saying that at this point inflationary expectations are coming down. In the question and answer session, he did make it clear, though, that that has a lot to do with the fact that we've had a collapse in global oil prices from November last year. They're now climbing higher, and of course that brought our domestic inflation rate down, and that does tend to influence inflationary expectations and tends to bring it down. So that looks a little bit better. Saying that food prices very much under control at the moment, but they do expect it to turn later this year. And then the main pressure really being the electricity tariffs and concern about what would happen to the exchange rate, although given their current forecast, they're not expecting a tremendous amount of inflationary pressure to come from the rand.
Is it not weird, though, that you have those two elements, particularly fuel, you have electricity prices which have gone up in double digits, right? And yet still no change really to that inflation outlook, which pretty much remains the same, 4.8% for this year, 5.3% for 2020, even going down to 4.7% for 2021. And yet he still doesn't see any scope for a drop in interest rates.
Yeah, I think what is happening here is indeed there's no demand pressure on prices. I think that's the key at the moment, and that to some extent will also offset the impact of something like the rise in electricity tariffs and over the next 3 years. But of course what you've got is you've got a fairly high and sticky structure to inflation in South Africa, and now what we're anticipating is you're coming off a low base. And from that low level, oil prices are now drifting higher, food prices will eventually turn in the cycle. And from that higher level, because you're coming off that low base, the impact on inflation at the higher end will be, as your cycle peaks next year, will be over 5%, which they've indicated they're uncomfortable with. I think in the question and answer session, it was clear that he repeatedly said that they want to stabilize inflationary expectations around the midpoint of the target range, which is about 4.5%. So it's that upward lift towards the end of the year, because inflation, monetary policy is supposed to be forward-looking, that is, I think, impacting on their decision just to hold at this point.
Gerald, how do you feel about that 4.5% midpoint?
Look, I think that for most South African consumers, even a 25 basis point increase in the repo rate
cut.
No, cut is good.
Yes.
But the increase, he did allude to the fact that probably before the end of this year, we will get an adjustment
to the quarterly projection.
So the 4.5 midpoint, I still feel, is unaffordable because most consumers are already stretched as things are. So although consumers would have greatly welcomed the 25 basis point cut, the average consumer is already in that space where they cannot take too many more financial shocks. If you look in terms of South Africa and how South Africans tend to behave, this year is a big sporting year. So we've got AFCON.
I would know.
rugby, AFCON, cricket, World Cup, Women's World Cup. All these things are probably going to benefit the economy a bit because consumers do go out and spend a little bit more. There's that feel-good factor, especially if all the sporting codes are doing well. So I guess there could be upside even on the economic growth numbers, which will surprise us towards the end of the year. But in general, I think that even at 4.5%, the average consumer is already screaming, I'm underwater, help, I need help.
Yeah. So at this level, keeping interest rates unchanged doesn't help much.
I think it doesn't help much. The advice to the consumer right now would be, still try exit any debt you're currently holding and, save. Start preparing for that future because the outlook in general is that, we are going to start entering an inflationary cycle probably going into next year. The one thing, obviously, which the governor could not address in his speech is the elections and the outcome of the elections, which will also have a significant impact impact on where inflation could go and how monetary policy could be directed. It's anyone's guess what's going to happen after the elections, but it is the elephant in the room which will affect everyone's pocket.
I wonder if they've gotten any word with regards to that, with regards to some pressure as well as we lead up to those elections. But it's one that we can probably only ask the governor in confidence. Those growth figures, Nikki, 1.3% for 2019, 2020 1.8% and 2% for 2021. Mm-hmm. Agree?
I agree with them adjusting it downwards, yes. But we adjusted ours. We had 1.3, they've now initially, and then with all the load shedding, we did some calculations about the likely impact of the load shedding we've had already up until the end of March on the first quarter. And then we make some assumptions on Eskom's general state and what's likely to happen going forward. And the conclusion for us is that we needed to shave our GDP forecast even, shave it off a little bit more. And we've got basically 0.9% for this year, only 1.6% for next year, and only 1.9% for 2021, which means that we don't even touch 2%.
Look, you get close in 2020, in 2021.
It really is. It's 0.1. I agree.
Look, it's nothing of a muchness, really, right? 0.9% and 1.3%. The difference isn't that stark, is it?
It is, I think, psychologically, you know, and especially given the factors that are driving growth lower. It's almost like we just find a little bit of momentum. It's very moderate momentum, and it's been the pattern for the last 4 or 5 years, and then we get struck down by some other supply side shock, whether it be the uncertainty of politics, policy, adverse policy developments, or whether it be repeated load shedding. It's been the pattern. Whenever we go over like 2% growth, it's almost like this economy's structure and its infrastructure is simply not built at this point to sustain growth of 2% over on a quarterly basis.
Yeah, we continue to say that we're linked to the global economy in many ways because what happens in other countries certainly affects us, whether it be a commodity cycle, whether it be in other ways. But the one issue is that with a global slowdown in growth, we're bound to be affected by that too. And that is clear in these numbers, isn't it? And perhaps could even go lower.
I actually think the bigger factor in their adjustment was the problems at Eskom and the impact of load shedding. Because by last year already, they would have calculated or brought into their calculations and projections the anticipation of slower global growth. I agree that in the last couple of months, the global situation has deteriorated. We are seeing far more nervous behavior from investors. The US yield curve, is flattened out. There were periods that it even inverted, which is generally a sign of recession. But I don't think it's done that long enough and on a protracted basis so that you can conclude the world economy is entering recession, which is a fairly severe state to be in. Having said that, though, from basically 2015-16, the world economy had a fantastic period. South Africa completely missed out on that. It had no impact on our manufacturing or our mining. And during the course of last year, we saw promising recovery in manufacturing exports. So if the world economy does slow, it could disrupt that, which would be a pity. And maybe they've calculated that in, but I think they would have made that adjustment last year already.
Yeah. Gerald, that growth figure doesn't aid anybody, right? I mean, look at it. If you take a look at population growth at the levels it's at, then you take this, we still haven't grown anyway.
We're not going anywhere. In fact, if you probably look at population growth and in terms of unemployment, probably we might even be going backwards.
Yeah.
So, the load shedding has actually got a serious impact on SMEs, the small businesses. I've done walkabouts and I've seen the barber shops and the small businesses which are employing 3, 4, 5 people. Yeah. Those are the areas of the economy which will get us going again. And load shedding has hit them hardest. And as much as Eskom is telling us they've suspended load shedding, we still also hear the rumor mill saying winter is coming. So it's almost Game of Thrones fear factor around. So I think the one thing we need to address, and as the governor said, that a lot of our problems are structural internally. Yeah. We need to start creating jobs. Creating jobs means the average man starts to earn an income. Someone who's not earning or someone who's earning an income, life gets a bit better. People start spending spending more. We need to stop this dependency on foreign direct inflows. So in a cruel way, perhaps, a Moody's downgrade will actually get us working on our own in terms of having less reliance on external forces.
I've always argued that question and always said that indeed it is a possibility, right? It is. Should we not just get, for lack of a better term, a spank up the bum to really say, here you are, you've been downgraded completely to non-investment grade, and now you have to find your way out of it. And yes, as the governor mentioned, you get an L shape with regards to that growth, but it does mean that when you pick up, you're not picking up because of other people.
Yes.
You're picking up because of your own structural issues. Can consumers aid that process, though?
Well, yes. As a savings institute, this is where we come in. We're trying to tell people to save. And everyone says, I'm not earning enough. I don't feel like saving.
And financial planning, which is what you do.
And financial planning as well is difficult because people are saying, all those risk policies, I don't need them right now. If I die, it's okay. The world is horrible enough as it is. So in reality, yes, I tend to agree with your viewpoint, which is saying that sometimes we need to start driving our economy internally. We need to get domestic spending up internally. We need to have less reliance on currency shifts, less reliance on oil prices. Yes, the oil price can come back down because Venezuela looks like it's getting fixed. If Donald Trump gets his way, Venezuela starts supplying oil again to the world economy, they'll force prices down because they want to get back in shape. But we need to stop looking outside. We need to look inside. And internally, we are getting things wrong. Load shedding is negatively affecting everyone, and it's negatively affecting the one engine which probably can get our economy going, which is small business.
Yeah. Okay. So it becomes a lot more difficult no matter what. It doesn't matter what happens. And then you get Friday's decision by Moody's. Your estimates are possibly not for a downgrade in the entire rating?
Moody's have always tended to be very kind to us. They are, of course, a little bit disappointed because we haven't lived up to any of our promises.
It's getting more difficult to keep us where we are.
To keep the smile on their faces. So I think the bottom line is, they have more than enough reason to downgrade us. There's more than enough, quantitative evidence to take that route. But because I think they would like to give us a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, there is an acknowledgement that politically there has been a change, and consequently, I think they probably want to see what happens in the elections before they make a.
Is that going to help?
It does help, yes.
The holding of the rate at where it is, and perhaps then only changing the outlook or something or the other.
You'll see the governor actually spoke quite a bit about that. Has it been priced in? Has it not been priced in? The conclusion among our dealers anyway is that it's been priced in. And even if we do kicked out of Citibank's World Government Bond Index, we'll probably get included in the Frontier Index, and in the Frontier bundle we look fantastic. So you probably still see the capital flow coming in. So it is a function of whether it's priced in or not. No one will really know. I think when that decision is made, there will be a bit of a wobble, but it might prove to be very temporary.
Do we deserve the benefit of the doubt that we keep getting from the global markets, Gerald?
Well, I think so. I think the global markets are looking at President Cyril Ramaphosa and saying that he inherited a government which he did not form himself. And an election is one of those watersheds when he can actually form a new government should the ANC win the elections, or we can have different outcomes. So I think, for them to downgrade just before an election, literally, a month or two before elections, might seem rash. I would probably say they might change the outlook to negative, but they're not going to probably downgrade the country. And probably as well, it's been priced in. This is the talk of the economists, and we shouldn't fear the downgrade as much as it might sound, because it actually might bring some light at the end of the tunnel, in that we actually start playing and being compared to the markets probably we should be getting compared to, because often we know we are treated as a mid-income country and compared to similar nations, but in reality, no, we're an emerging market. We should be compared to our peers. So going down into the second division might be a good thing, because suddenly you're winning the championship.
Our growth doesn't make us look like an emerging market nation, though. Surely, at least one minuscule percentages, if you want to call it that. Yes, I agree. Now, the likes of China obviously coming down with regards to their growth. They're far gone from those double-digit growth figures they had many years ago. But are we perhaps building what should be the right foundation? And I say that because, yes, we're down right now and we see that we can't get the growth up. But the whole point then is to say, okay, fine, let's clear out and let's perhaps build a solid base from which we can then get sustainable growth as an economy. Do you see us doing that, Gerald?
I think the sustainable growth has been around us all along. It's called Africa. And the problem is because we've been treated as this mid-income developing country, we've looked at countries like Turkey for indications of where we might be going, when we should be looking around us and saying, what's going on in Zimbabwe and Zambia? What can we supply there? Yeah. And I think that's where we've probably also missed out on that global growth in the last couple of years, in that a lot of it occurred in Africa. And it occurred often in territories which are within arm's length of our economy, but we're too focused on supplying Brexit and countries which are not necessarily, proximate to us in terms of supply and similar to us in terms of demographics. We've got a young population, and that young population is going to need jobs. The jobs pressure is starting to ratchet up, and should unemployment start sneaking into the 30s, I think it will start putting significant pressure, and domestically it will also start boiling, because I think we know South Africans, people have been asking for jobs for a while, and we enter the 30s, we're going into unknown territory. You'll talk to a lot of financial planners, they'll start telling you also that people are starting to talk the E word again. Immigration is starting to happen again. I spoke to an estate agent yesterday saying that housing stock is starting to go up, especially in the mid to higher income levels, because the buyers are all starting to looking at plane tickets, and the sellers, and there's no buyers. And so I think those are the domestic issues we really need to start focusing on, in terms of saying, how can we start fixing the economy from within?
Yeah. Nikki, your sentiments as well around that? Solid enough base? Have we created the enabling environment?
Okay, it's a very difficult question to answer for us, because we might sound a little bit skeptical. Our sense is no. There's a lot of lip service given to creating an investment environment, but when it comes to actually putting in place the kind of legislative changes, getting them through, implementing them, and then making the changes on the ground that will bring about this so-called enabling environment, I don't think anything's really moved forward. And added to that, we just have a more encouraging rhetoric coming from our president in terms of wanting to create a more investment-friendly environment and wanting to lower the cost of production. As the governor said, that is the key. But do South Africans really understand what the implications are of lowering the cost of production? Do they really understand what it means? At Eskom, for example, it might mean that you have to restructure. You have to retrench some people in the short term in order to get the economy growing over the longer term for the benefit of all. So there are short-term costs attached to this. And I'm not sure that we are ready to accept those, and therefore policy tends to stall.
It's going to be a difficult one, folks. I appreciate your time. It's a difficult conversation to have, even after the Reserve Bank governor has at least kept things, as they sort of are.
Steady.
We'll hope for better interactions and better conversations. Thank you certainly for the time there. Of course, our guests, Nikki Weimar, who is senior economist at Nedbank, and Gerald Mwandiambira, who is the acting CEO of the South African Savings Institute, of course, currently an author as well, and a financial planner. Certainly that conversation will continue. We'll do it again in 2 months' time, when the MPC decides whether to keep interest rates as are, 6.75% for that repo rate, or perhaps change things up a bit. We'll certainly see how things fare. And of course, we edge ever nearer to that election time as well. And the next MPC meeting will be in May, which will be actually right after that election day. So it will be interesting to see how things fare on that front. But for me, it is goodbye. Thank you so much for watching Market Sense. Of course, you will have more news coming up at the top of the hour. It's goodbye from me.